So now that we've talked about gear, more specifically the lenses, camera body, accessories, care items that you can use for your setup, let's go ahead and talk about the actual camera itself. So what settings can we implement in order to make sure we are shooting the best possible images? And in this video, I'm going to start with image quality. So how can we make sure we are getting the highest quality images right out of the camera? I'm going to be going through what the differences are between RAW versus JPEG image formats. I'm going to give you my personal recommendation between the two. Then I'm also going to go through a few more settings that you can implement in order to maximize how clean your photos look. So let's go ahead and start from the top. What is the difference between a RAW versus a JPEG image? Now, you've probably heard the term JPEG image if you've spent any time on the internet. It's one of the most popular image formats in the world. However, RAW is a bit more on the covert side, and it's a bit of a secret word in the photography community. RAW files are exactly like they sound. They're much more stripped down than a JPEG image. They look much more basic when they come right out of the camera, but they do have a lot more information embedded within them. And by this, I mean they have a much larger dynamic range and they can capture more color details. And we're gonna go over dynamic range a bit more in the exposure video, but for now, all you really need to know is that these RAW files will essentially give you more detail in the shadows and the highlights of your image. So when you take these photos and you go to edit them, if you edit a RAW file, you're going to be able to work with the image much more, pull out more details, and make much more substantial changes to it. If you're shooting with a JPEG image, there's not going to be a lot of information to work with, and you're mainly going to be stuck within a certain box for how the JPEG image interpreted the file. So really, if you're going to be shooting RAW, you really need to know how to edit, because this is what a RAW file looks like straight out of the camera. It's completely underdeveloped and nothing has been done to it. However, if you edit it, you can turn that file into this. And we're going to be going through that entire editing process in the editing part of this course. But for now, that's really all you need to know. It holds much more information. However, this amount of information does come with a cost. So RAW files are generally much larger in size than a JPEG file, which if you have a lot of patience for uploading your files to the computer and you plan on spending a lot of time editing, then it's perfectly fine to take as many RAW files as you want. However, if you want to be able to edit fairly quickly and you're going to be working with a massive amount of photos, for example, if you're shooting in burst mode for whatever reason, then you might want to consider shooting JPEG just so that you can edit and offload those photos much quicker. Some great examples of this would be if you're shooting sports. Sometimes in portraits, I still like to shoot RAW portraits, but I'm not always doing burst mode portraits very often, so it's not too big of a deal for me. But that's just one thing to keep in mind. They are a much larger file size. So what's my personal recommendation? For me, I always shoot in RAW file format. It's very rare that I'm working with thousands of photos. I would say for almost every single shoot I go on, I come home with between 100 to 400 photos, and generally it's more in the middle range of that. So 200 to 300, I would say, is about the average, which isn't a lot of RAW files to work with, and I usually cull through them fairly quickly about which ones I actually want to edit and put the time into working with. So shooting with RAW obviously has its details because I want to be able to pull out as much detail as possible and be able to make as many changes as I can when I import it to Lightroom and Photoshop. The only time I ever really shoot JPEG is if I'm just doing snapshots. So for example, if I'm just hanging out with friends, just casually taking photos of stuff that I'm probably not going to want to edit, I'll shoot JPEGs. So for example, if you're at a family event, maybe that's a good time to shoot JPEGs. Or if I'm doing time lapses. Now, this is a debatable topic. If you're doing a professional time lapse, say you're working for Nike or something, you might want to take the time to go through and edit all of those in RAW file format. But for me, most of the time when I'm making a time lapse, I want to be able to make it quickly because it's going to be in a vlog. So generally, I'll just shoot those in JPEG so I can edit them and offload them rather quickly. So the moral of the story is always shoot RAW if you can, because you're going to be working with much more detail and have much more flexibility in the editing process. So one thing some photographers like to do is to shoot RAW and JPEG. And a lot of cameras have this option where it will put both files in your SD card for you. So if you're just starting off and you want to see the difference between the two, you can go ahead and experiment with that a little bit. One practice that I've heard a lot of photographers do is to have 2 SD cards. So if you have a higher end camera, you can put 2 SD cards in your camera and then have it set up so the top SD card is shooting RAW format and the bottom SD is shooting JPEG. And then that way, if your RAW SD card fails for whatever reason, then you'll have a backup on JPEG. All right, so what are some additional settings you might see in your camera related to image quality? And one term you might see is compressed versus uncompressed versus lossless compression. And generally, when you're in the menu selecting RAW or JPEG, you'll see this setting somewhere. And this generally means how big is the RAW file you're going to be shooting. So obviously, if you compress a file, you're going to lose a little bit of quality. So generally, I would veer towards shooting uncompressed instead of compressed. However, if your camera is a bit more high end, you might have the option for lossless compression. And this essentially means it's going to retain 99% of the data from the RAW file, but it's going to somehow make the image smaller. Another thing you might see is the term white balance. So white balance is also known as the temperature of an image. And this denotes between a warm versus a cool image. Generally, this is measured on the Kelvin scale from 1000 to 10,000. So a 1000 temperature image is going to be the warmest, whereas a 10,000 Kelvin image is going to be the coolest. You can go into your camera settings and adjust warmth versus coolness based off the effect you want. And one thing to note is that if you're shooting in RAW format, for the most part, you can change the temperature in post-production without really any harm to the photo at all. However, if you are shooting JPEG, then you're gonna want to adjust the white balance within your camera so that you can make sure it's actually coming out how you want. So the moral of the story here is if you're shooting RAW, the white balance doesn't matter too much. I generally keep it on the auto setting within my camera, which adjusts based off where I'm at. But if you are going to be shooting JPEG, then you're gonna want to adjust it manually. Another setting that you might see in the image quality realm is the resolution. So if you're shooting on a full frame camera, as we talked about in the camera video, then make sure you are shooting at full resolution. A lot of full frame cameras, you can actually turn them into a crop mode camera by simply selecting an option, but I really don't see any reason why you would do this because it makes sense to just have the highest quality image possible. However, when you are shooting with a crop, it does zoom in a bit more, so that could be one reason why you want to do that, but still, I'd rather just crop later on in post-production if I need to. Another setting that you might see is the bit rate, and this essentially refers to the amount of color information in an image. So if you have an option between a 14 versus a 12 bit rate, you generally want to choose the higher bit rate, and this essentially means there's going to be more colors in your image when you're taking photos. All right, so that's the basics on image quality. Not too much to keep in mind there, but once you get those settings dialed in, you're essentially ready to go. So don't think too much about it. Just shoot RAW, uncompressed or compressed lossless, and keep your white balance on auto and keep your bit rate high, and you will be in good standing. Let's go ahead and hop into the next video.